ICCM Conversations, Ethics in Community Music, an African Perspective. Today, we were just listening to a track that's covered by Ghetto Classics, and you can see the link to that in the YouTube. We thought we'd open today with that because some of the presenters will refer to this group in their presentations. It's lovely to see so many of you joining us. Welcome all on the call. Thank you so much for joining today. And this is our final online event of the series. It's now just over a year since we began running events online in this way, initially starting as a response to lockdown. We sought ways to connect with others for research-focused community music dialogue. And from our early events, we learned that there were many people interested to connect in this way. And across the series, people have joined from many different places, including Denmark, Germany, Italy, Ireland, Canada, the US, Brazil, South Africa. And we've had people staying up very late or waking up very early from the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and joining us here in the UK. And I'm sure I've missed out some countries. So if that's you, you're welcome to pop your place in the chat. Recognising the potential of this online event series as a platform whereby an international community of community musicians can explore what community music does and what it might become, we developed the ICCM Conversation series, which this event is part of today. And through ICCM Conversations, we seek to promote and support research-focused dialogue and exchange, the development of community music scholarship, and a platform for multi-voiced perspectives and contexts. This is what today's ICCM Conversations event seeks to do, to offer a space to share, to connect, and reflect together. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Otukile Phibion, Dr. Mukasa Wafula, Levi, Wataka, and Dr. Elizabeth Andang'o to share their perspectives and to lead the conversations today. Okay, so I've got the lovely job now of welcoming our four presenters who are going to lead us in our conversations. We have Phibion, who is a Music Education Associate Professor at the University of Botswana. Phibion is a specialist in community music research, going into the community, negotiating with knowledgeable elders and cultural custodians for ethnomusicological data collection. We have Mukasa, who is a lecturer at the Technical University of Kenya, specialising in transcultural musicology with a leaning to African musicology. Levi is a Master of Music Education student at Kenyatta University. He is director with the National Youth Orchestra of Kenya, Nairobi Children's and the Safaricom Youth Orchestras. And finally, Elizabeth is a lecturer in the Department of Music and Dance at Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Kenya. And she is Associate Editor for Africa of the International Journal of Music in Early Childhood. So welcome, it's amazing to have you here. And I think we'll get started straight away if I pass over to you, Phibion.
Thank you very much, Jo. Let me start with my presentation there. And for us to understand the meaning of ethics in African music, we need to first understand what African music is. And then in Africa, music is a social activity in which almost everyone participates. Music highlights African with various traditions accompanied by a melody. Many events of importance are celebrated with music, whether it is marriage, a birth, or ceremonial rite of passage. African music is music that is indigenous to Africa. Traditional African music may be defined as that music which is associated with traditional African institutions of pre-colonial era. It is the music that has survived the impact of the forces of the Western and other forms of acculturation and is therefore distinct in idiom and orientation from the music belonging to the category, namely contemporary, popular, and art music. African music is music of the Black Africans living south of the Sahara, as distinct from the Arab music, not Africa. However, the above does not portray in full what African music really is, because we are aware that with the fact that not all Africans are Black, it would be incomplete to exclude music of Africans who are not Black from African music. Then going on to ethics. Ethics is the branch of philosophy which studies the nature of and critical of right and wrong action, obligation, value, and the good life and religious principles. Ethics is discussed in the socio-cultural context. It is concerned not only with analysis of concept, but also justifications and principles of how life should be lived. African ethical thought is the product of various historical and socio-cultural circumstances. Then there is a fivefold characterization of the form of African ethical thought. Traditional societies are communitarian or communalistic. Rights are essentially corporate, associated with family, lineage, village, or society. The structure of thought is anti-universalistic. The ethical reach extends to as far as the boundaries of the community, not beyond to some imagined global or universal community. Traditional ideas are naturalistic. Gods, spirits, ancestors regulate life in the natural world. There is often no clearly differentiated and distinctively moral vocabulary. In ethics as a discourse is the differentiated, say, from aesthetics or certain forms of technical language. African systems of thought are profoundly centered on the contemporary concerns of human beings, including ancestors, rather than on otherworldly considerations. And with my conclusion, not all pre-colonial African societies exhibit similar features. In discussion, ethics in African music we should acknowledge the substantial ethical crisis produced by the combined forces of modernization, urbanization, literacy, and imitation of artistic modes of expression. And at the end of my presentation, I've shared some references there, which I've also sent to Joe. Thank you very much. I think I'm in time for the 6 minutes, which is stipulated for my presentation.
Lovely, thank you, Phibion. I think actually you're under 6 minutes, so we might have some time for some discussions about your presentation in connection to your practice and your teaching in Botswana later. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. If you want to stop screen sharing now, and we'll move on to Mukasa. Brilliant. I think there'll be some more time to dig into some of what you've presented as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So I'll be presenting on some ethical reflections about the musicians and the community. And in thinking about musicians, I'm imagining that we do not have a homogeneous musician in African settings. We have got different musicians with different roles. We have support singers, lead singers, dancers, instrumentalists, and so on. So I'm putting them as musicians so that I can accommodate the fact that they come from different areas of expertise, but working together. And in looking at the community, I'm looking at maybe the ones that existed before the colonial period, but they are also existing right now, and maybe into the modern ones, because some of the issues that I'll raise would easily affect the communities right now. In looking at a musician or musicians, I'm looking at them from a point of resource persons in a community. Resource persons in the fact that they are endowed with unique talents and gifts that uniquely contribute to the community's functions and the overall functioning of the community. And they can be equated to people like artisans, to midwives, and all that I have listed here. In looking at a musician, this is a multifaceted person in the community because they perform various roles. One, they are musical, where they entertain the community, they compose songs, they sing, they play instruments, they dance and everything. They are social, they are within the social context, they talk about historical aspects of the community, they are social arbiters, they are cultural arbiters, and they are agents of social communication. But within their music, they also educate the community from the song text that they do. And you'll find that some of them, especially who are the instrumentalists, are actually the educators of the prospective players of the instruments. And at the end of the day, they also play an entrepreneurial role. You'll find the same musicians are the ones who manufacture or make the instruments. At the same time, they make a living out of whatever they do. But there is something that really concerns me about the whole question of ethics, that most of the musicians in the communities that we have, especially in Kenya, and maybe some of the references that I have drawn from other parts of Africa, is that they live nomadic lives. These people here do not have settled homes. Most of them are ever on the move, looking for better, greener pastures. Many of them experience several social problems. They have broken relationships. They have got poor drinking habits. Beyond the performance arena, they are hardly appraised. And most of them, whenever they die, is when we realize the problems that they have had. Most of them do not have resting places. Most of them do not have families that they are attached to. And in academia, if you compare the word musician to other aspects of music that have been researched on, you'll find that comparatively, the musician is less addressed compared to other levels of research. And if you could just refer to some of the texts, like one of the best is actually Alan Merriam's Anthropology of Music. Out of the 15 chapters, only one chapter is geared towards addressing the issue of the musician. So there is something that is maybe wrong or something that needs to be addressed. But in as much as I raise this, I want also to recognize the fact that in selected instances, these musicians actually bypass these pitfalls due to the musicianly role that they offer in the community. And some of the literature that alludes to the fact that there is a problem is where they actually tell us that the musicians are reputable. But in as much as they are reputable, they are going to go ahead to tell us that, but their reward is liberal, which means they may be paid, they may not be paid, or after all, they can be given anything. But what do you look at now? What does the community offer the musician? Having looked at what the musician is capable of offering the community, you'll find that most of them are quite relegated. They will recognize maybe the lead musician, but when it comes to the other musicians who support the lead musicians, like the dancers, like the players of the instruments or the support singers, then you'll hardly see them being recognized anywhere. Two, you look at musicians from maybe a sense of professional or being non-professional. And where I draw from Miriam and Bebe's idea of professionalism to be in terms of whether they earn directly and entirely from their trade. And in most cases, you'll find that they play for pleasure. And some of them play basically to maintain tradition. And others play because there'll be some little handouts, but there is no substantial pay from whatever they do. But again, in terms of social status, you find that most of these musicians here do not have a well-defined status in the society. In most cases, they are among the most ridiculed people. Okay, if today I asked a question amongst the people, let's say in Kenya, who amongst you would like their daughter or their son to be married by a musician, quite a number of them will shy away. Why? Because the musician has got many issues that are unaddressed. And in the community, they are actually not as much. So looking at this, is that there is no clear criteria for how the community gives back to the musicians in as much as the musicians give so much to the community. In this way, they basically actually swim in quite troubled waters. So in terms of us as researchers who are interested in the question of ethics and research, I have the following questions that I'd like to pose to colleagues who are listening to me today. That what approaches can be employed that will ensure voluntary and as much information is shared from these people, looking at the fact that they have got many issues that are unaddressed. Two, how can research address issues related to ethics in reference to the reflections concerning the music and the community, the issues I've just talked about? Is there anything as researchers that we can use our prowess of, going out to seek information and bring the information to the people to help address the issues that I have talked about? And how can researchers work towards safeguarding the musicians' personal privacy, yet finding and presenting pertinent information concerning them? And what are the chances of maybe collaborative research where musicians benefit from volunteering information by being exposed further? And lastly, maybe look at, besides acknowledging their names, how can we as researchers positively give them an artistic face to the acknowledgements that we make of the information that we have gotten from the field whenever we carry out our research? And in case of any information that you'd like to know about all that I have presented, here are my resources, and they have also been shared with Joe. I hope I have not gone beyond my 6 minutes. Thank you very much.
Mukasa, thank you so much. And I'm really sorry, I must have really drilled that in the 6 minutes in our preparation meetings for today's event. Thank you both for your wonderful presentations. There's lots of things there that we could go on to discuss in our breakouts, and we do have a Google Doc. Mukasa, I thought it was very interesting there how you're pointing out what does the community offer the musician? We might think, what does the community offer the community musician or the music educator? And I think it'd be great to tease out some of that. We can add your questions to the Google Doc for consideration in the breakouts, Mukasa. And Phibion, I wondered, we already have a couple of questions for you for the group. I wondered if you wanted to talk about those questions a little bit, seeing as though you didn't use your full 6 minutes, before we go off and respond to those.
Thanks, Joe. You want me to talk about my questions before the group discusses the questions?
Yeah, sounds great, because what we'll do now is we'll just digest all of that information from the presentations into some breakout conversations.
Okay, so my first question to the group is, what elements give character to African traditional or indigenous music? If we look at music, how can we see that this is African music? What will tell us, what will inform us that this is African music? The elements that will, the characters of African music, as opposed or compared to other traditional musics. So that is the first question. And then the second question What determines ethics in African traditional music? We know the African societies are formed of different tribes. When you come to Botswana, we have more than 23 tribes. Each of those tribes practice their own musical genre. And then the ethical considerations are not the same for those tribes. If you go to every tribe, you'll find different ethical considerations determined by the musical genres practiced among those tribes. So that is what I can say for my two questions.
Brilliant, lovely. And Rory's just posted a summary of those in the chat. What I propose now, and Mukasa, thank you for sharing yours in the chat too. I suggest we go to some breakout conversations now for responses to the presentations and the questions. We'll have about 15 minutes in our groups, and then we'll come back for our next presentations.
I think what the guy was saying about how many tribes there are, how many different types of African musics there are. To talk about African music is such a large thing. So when you think about ethics, it needs to be culturally nuanced across the different parts of Africa, the different tribes. Because the picture that was painted of the musicians in Kenya was quite different to my experience of the role of the griot in West Africa. Where they don't drink, they're part of the Muslim community, which has obviously impacted on the traditions in a different way. But in the tradition, they go to a village and people, you know, if the griot wants someone's coat, the person gives them their coat, or, you know, they're very well esteemed and rewarded. I don't know if other people have experience of different areas of Africa.
I think one of the professors made a distinction. So I want to make sure I understood this, but in relation, Holly, to what you said about that they were positioning indigenous African music as located in Southern Africa as opposed to Northern Africa. But I don't know whether, did anyone else catch that distinction, or is there like, and I don't know, like, I don't know enough. I know a little bit about Ghanaian, just a little bit, but I'm not very familiar. So I'm not like, I have a hard time even addressing these questions because I feel very ignorant. So for me to say what the elements give character to African traditional music, I feel like that is not something that I can speak to. I don't even know how to begin to answer that question.
I think that's a great way to start answering it, actually, Deanna. Like, it's, I feel the same. I was like, oh, I'm not sure. Having flashback of a project I did over 10 years ago with some Ugandan musicians who visited Scotland, I was immediately trying to drum in to that work. And again, feeling ignorant and not knowledgeable. But I wonder whether it's just what elements give character. I wonder whether it's a bit more of an open question as us as non-specialists outside of Africa. You know, what elements do we see? Do we see as character as because the first thing I thought about actually was dancing, which he mentioned, and it was interesting how he immediately placed dancers in a different way. And thinking back to the Garhu project that I think was one of the first ICCM conversations, actually. So it's almost gone full cycle. And I guess as an outsider looking on that full embodiment experience, and my small experience of working alongside some Ugandan musicians in Scotland 10 years ago were from a dance academy. So that again was very, very built into dance and movement within that. So it is tricky. Tough question.
Yeah, I actually have heard this distinction before, and I've seen it of the kinds of music in the various parts of Africa. I know that movement is making music, right? That moving your body is making music, and that's talked with a few musicians who are like, why would you stand still? That makes no sense. Like, that's this Western European like choir, we're very still, the music speaks for itself. Like, that makes no sense for a number of practices. So I don't know if that might be like this integrative, especially music and drum and dance. I don't know that, again, I'm not making a sweeping generalization, but of what I know, those like that those three things often go together. Not always, but often. Holly, is that like does that resonate, or is it different from the music practices that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context as well. Like if it's in the context of a sort of communal family celebration, let's say a wedding or a naming ceremony, then dance is part of that. But there's also occasions where for instance, the kora player would sit and play and sing songs about history, and people would simply listen. So there wouldn't be necessarily dance all the time. There's a place for this historical sort of sharing of lineage and tradition that is more kind of received. But yeah, I totally agree. Like people will move, people do move in a way that's our traditional Western audiences. We're all primed to sit still and be quiet, aren't we? So, and people will call out in response. So even if they're sitting and not moving, they will respond. They'll say, and this happened in history, and that, people add and contribute. So I guess people are much more a part of the music. I think a sort of sorry, I won't keep saying it, but just thinking about the music element of it. From my experience, it tends to be less focused on harmonic modulation and more around the use of ostinato and repetition. So whereas we're sort of fascinated with all the sort of modulation possibilities and stuff, actually in Africa it is a different focus. It's less sort of harmonic sequence kind of thing, if that resonates with anybody else's experience.
Yeah, kind of a polyrhythms. So I've heard that phrase. Like Isai Barnwell, who's a member of Sweet and Honey Rock, writes about African American music actually. So it's not, but I think there are roots in that tradition of these interlocking rhythms. And varying. Like so again, I'm speaking now more on Ewe music, but that there's interlocking rhythms. And some of those are extremely complex rhythms, and some of them are actually a little more simple, so that there are ways for people to participate based on whether they're very experienced or not experienced at all. But they all come together to create this really complex sound, but really rhythmic, and an understanding of rhythm that's different too from, speaking of Western, like where we're like, where's the one? Like 1, 2, 3, like we're constantly trying to like count in 4s, maybe in 3s, maybe in 6, 8 if we're really going wild, and they're and the rhythms as I understand, again, very, very, very preliminary, but that there's a very different understanding of what rhythm means too, that it's in addition to harmony, right? That it's not sort of boxed in these, where there's a downbeat kind of pulse. Pulse is different, and it still feels a little mysterious to me, but there's something there too. Laura?
I wonder how much that speaks to the notion of the embodiment of the music. When I was making comparisons, and again, like you said, sort of, it's tough to not just broadly generalize, because I also have no background in this. But when you speak about in Western, choral music, and we stand, and it's like we have to know where one is, because we don't have those rhythms embodied. And so it's like a different way of perhaps thinking, not to say that musics in Africa aren't also often looked at as, feeling a downbeat, as we would say in Western classical music. But yeah, it's certainly something in our school system and in our music education system in the Western world, where dance, I think, has been removed so far from music, and movement and it's like we have to kind of force that oftentimes. And when we're doing circle games with young children, and when you see, like, I've done Kodai training, and when you have adults brought into that, to get them to move, myself included, is like pulling teeth.
I teach music students at a university level, and they, not all of them, but many of them, very dislike anything that's related to the body, because they're musicians. They're not dancers. They didn't come here to learn how to dance, right?
Yeah.
So you make music that has nothing to do with your body. It's a bit, yeah.
I found it really interesting when I think it was Mukasa who said that the main musician may be sort of revered or looked upon with more respect, but then like the dancers and may not be. So I find that really interesting. And I'm not sure, obviously, whether that's broadly speaking in Southern Africa, or if that's, relevant to specific traditions and specific tribes. But I just found it interesting that there felt like a separation in the way he spoke of it, but also, I mean, who knows? I'm not sure. Maybe I was misinterpreting that, but so I guess I'm wondering what musician. I don't know how to, like, that to me speaks of like a performance, right, with like a solo musician or one main musician. And in a, like he said, I guess he was speaking about the performance arena, actually, as I'm thinking through this and speaking through this, rather than perhaps sort of more community-based music making. I don't know if I'm making sense, but like I'm feeling like there was a distinction, but then is there? And how is it that communities may view the sort of backup musicians, as he sort of said, and the dancers, how they view them differently from a social perspective in terms of social status?
I mean, sort of thinking from my experience of my teacher's band in Gambia, he has a responsibility to paying all the other members of the band, and he looks after them and they're as family, but he takes on a very active role, actually making sure that they are really well provided for, but it may not be the same in other parts. So it comes back to that idea of Africa's massive and there'll be very different things. But I think embodied seems to be like the word that's sticking out for me, because we started with dancing, but embodied. Right. There's something embodied about African music that is less, not less cerebral, but we're so focused on certain aspects of music, and it's actually about that physicality of music, maybe.
Related to that, the other thing I wanted to mention and make sure I heard this up, but I think it was Professor Phibion talked about community being like the literal, like, geographic community, that it wasn't this imagined, like, larger idea. So I think those ideas might be linked. So I'm seeing nods, so I think I did hear that correctly. But that, like, I was like, whoa, that's an interesting idea. To, like, it actually needs to be physical. So just in terms of that embodiment, right? That they're actually talking about actual, real relationships of people who are in the same space together. So I think the sense of community, as he described it, sounds different from how often community music literature, where it's like a sense of belonging or an ideal, or there might be some connection, but there's definite difference.
More bounded. I got the feeling of being bounded as a community. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just talking about the recognition versus the value, because the musician's role is of course attached to what they contribute to an activity, an event. And we have music in so many of our various events. And so the musician then becomes valuable in that sense. But recognition in terms of the economic rewards, that is problematic. And it probably comes from a long time ago, where, if we had barter trade, what are you going to give in exchange for the music? So I'll come and perform at your function, and you'll give me beer, you'll give me food, but I'm not going to be carrying probably anything tangible back home. And this differed from community to community. So that recognition is probably, or the value is probably, a perception of the economic background or the economic stature or status of the musician. It has not been positive. And until very recently, when you have more financially literate music practitioners who set a fee, they will actually set a fee to what it is that they're doing. And this is a little more recent. I hope that makes sense. Sorry.
No, very much. I think I'm wondering as well, Phibion, does this speak to the anti-universalist perspective that you spoke to in your discussion of 5 different points of ethics? I see Jan Lee's got her hand up too.
Yes, the anti-universalistic factor means that I was talking about. Let me give you the example of Botswana with regard to the recognition of musicians. It used to be like that in the past, but I know Africa is diverse, it's quite diverse. Every country or every tribe practices what they want to practice. But in Botswana, it's quite different because we have what you call a presidential awards, which is carried out annually, nationally. It's a national event whereby musicians are pulled from all corners of the country. They compete and come, and the best are given the awards for practicing traditional music or for practicing their communal music. Even though they come from different areas with music that identifies them from the rest of the group.
With you. Jan-Lise, we've got a few more minutes. Do you want to say what you were wanting to say?
Yes, I think it kind of relates to what we're talking about. Perhaps what we need to also bring into this discussion is when we think about the kind of reciprocity that was raised, kind of what is the community giving to the musician, it goes beyond material things as well. I think an important thing to raise the idea of personhood, at least as it is seen in a communitarian way, perhaps within African philosophy in a larger sense. So in that, it is actually very important to discuss what the community is giving the musician, because you do not have personhood just by existing. It's something which is bestowed to you through your community ties, in some sense, at least as I understand the concept of personhood. Yeah, so it's just something to think about. It's actually not so strange to think about what the community is offering the community musician, because of the communalism and the different view of personhood, which then clashes with neoliberal values and the marketplace and all of those things that Emily also raised.
Welcome back. I think we're all back, actually. Well, I hope that was a good start to some of the conversations, everybody. What we'll do now, just looking around the room, if it's okay with you, Levi, shall we go to your presentation? Lovely. So I'm going to pass over to Levi.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good afternoon, everybody from wherever you're joining. My name is Levi Wataka, and I work as a community music practitioner. And just as a way of introduction, I said to my colleagues on this panel that I am just now starting a serious journey into academia. So I have been working mostly in the community and as an educator in schools. And I recently started doing a master's program. So part of my presentation is not as supported by quotations as might be expected in an academic setting. But I'd like to talk about an idea that we've been toying with in our work for a while, and it's diversity corridors. And I titled it The Growth of Professional Music Practice for Recreating Community in Africa. And this ties into Professor Otukile's presentation, because he said there is a pre-colonial, a colonial, and a post-colonial Africa. And the community has had to change at each of those moments as it was known. And then as Mukasa described it as well, what does it mean to be a musician in Africa? And that was a great definition of a musician in the African context as a person that actually belongs to the community in an intricate way that cannot be separated from as a musician as from the society that they are part of. And I'm looking at this bigger picture, and I was just thinking that the extension of Western values into Africa through trade, colonization, and evangelization, among other influences, has led to both systemic and consequential changes in Africa's concept of and approach to economic life in a bid to fit into the modern world. And when I say that in a bid to fit into the modern world, I mean by no choice, because of the economic speed and the developments, technological even, that mean you have to shape up or ship out. For you to survive, you have to fit in. International and local economic competition, political and administrative inefficiencies, and unregulated growth have led to economic stratification, resulting in poverty and deprivation for large parts of the populations of the world, especially in Africa. Music and the arts have often been an avenue for building a sense of identity, culture, and heritage as foundations for a stronger society and community, especially in these underprivileged populations, sort of as a source of dignity, reclaiming dignity when it's hard to find any in the system that engulfs you. The three musical initiatives example today represent a necessary response to a macro-ethical reality while trying to instill micro-ethical values. So we're looking at the bigger picture of how the infrastructure of the world is set up, but then trying to instill ethical lessons in each individual at the micro level. The selected programs, this is the Art of Music Foundation and Ghetto Classics in Kenya, the Mbale Brass Band and Mlisada in Uganda, are successful community music programs with educational and financial support of many international partners. There is little direct collaboration between them on the continent, and even less so between the supporting partners. So would it help to develop a corridor between such music programs? A program working in Nairobi might want to have a corridor to a program in Kampala. And I use the word corridor specifically because it is two-way, and you can have information or knowledge coming both ways, as well as a corridor to each program's international partner in Europe. And then here is now quick introductions about the programs. So Ghetto Classics, which serves up to about 1,000 children in Nairobi and 300 or 400 more in Mombasa, that's in Kenya. And it is a social action initiative, and it is aimed primarily at making an impact of some kind in the life of its members, improving the quality through quality music education. So over the past 10 years, the program has tried to develop a practical music curriculum for the delivery of music lessons, structured to attain the most professional standards in teaching, but somehow flexible enough to accommodate the unpredictable realities that are live in Korogosho and Mukuru kwa Ruben, where the program is domiciled. These are quick pictures of the Korogosho Center in Nairobi. So the first one there, that guy is called David. He's one of the leading violinists there, and this is St. John's Center. The second picture is Mukuru kwa Ruben, and that is the primary school with which we work with. Here is a trumpet lesson going on at Korogosho. And I just included one more picture of the background of Korogosho. If you Google Korogosho, it is famous for this landfill, which is a dump site that is the largest in this part of the world. And the building you see there is actually one of the rehearsal rooms at St. John's Korogosho. Moving on to the second group, Mbale, which was established by Philip Monk in 2006, and it is one of the most successful music initiatives in Africa. And it has boasted of a series of firsts in Africa, including one that I'd like to just mention now, which is the Mbale Schools Band will be participating in the Wheat Friday Championship next week, alongside a great youth brass bands and actually professional brass bands from Europe as well. And you can see pictures here of the Mbale Band in rehearsal there, and here's a poster of the Wheat Friday Championship that they will be part of next week. And if anybody's a brass enthusiast, that might be something to follow. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mlisada, which is Music, Life Skills and Institutional Aviation, which was started in Kampala by Bosco Segawa. And again, they have done quite a lot. So by now you start to see that the programs are very similar in what they try to attack through music, what they try to solve through music. There's a lot of similarity of the foundation of the programs and the change that they try to do. And so my discussion is trying to go towards, again here, these are pictures of Mlisada. You can start to see that just by looking at the pictures, you almost cannot tell right away that that is Uganda or that is Nairobi or Kinshasa or anywhere. There's a lot of similarities in the society, in the community in which these programs operate. And there is a few videos here that I would like to share, but I might leave that for later just to be conscious of time and maybe come back to them if time allows. And I will share these links as well so that anybody that's interested can be able to watch these videos in their own time. But I would like to look at the three sort of bigger questions, which is observing the unifying similarities about the selected community programs in East Africa. So the unifying similarities are extreme rural urban poverty, financial, and I say habitual poverty to mean there are things that are part of the community because they are a matter of survival. And so it's hard to break away from habits that might be holding you down in an economic way. Then novel idealism and cultural shift idea where we are, idealistic, trying to see a world that you're aware of, but you cannot access yet. Of course, systemic inconsistency. This has to do with the administrative and government systems, security, food, and health, and the emancipatory ideology, or what you can say the ghetto culture. So there's a certain almost belligerent but proud ghetto mentality that aids with the survival. Now, these are similarities across all of these programs. And I was just thinking if these are strong enough arguments for building educational, musical, and community corridors between these initiatives. Observing the implementation and how these communities run music, of course, they work towards community awareness, resilience, and ambition, strong intra and extra community partnerships, approaches to funding, challenges, innovation, and self-reliance versus charity and donations, enjoying and celebrating musical and community wins. And if you go on YouTube and if you look at the stories of all these programs, you can see the celebration of each community win. If it's a child going to school or somebody accessing cancer treatment or a house being built for someone that needed it. There's a lot of celebration of these community wins across all the programs. What aspects of these successes are transferable between initiatives and what aspects are not and why? So this is an open question because I actually do not have the answer to that. Finally, observing the continuity and support infrastructure, developing and sustaining educational, musical, and community best practice despite little direct government or corporate support. And so this is where attention and engagement by international community is a big part. For all these programs, there's quite a direct appeal to willing partners in the world to look at the structure and to see what partnerships can develop. Of course, international educational funding and community links as well become a part of the infrastructure for sustainability for these programs. And so that is my presentation for today. I would like to conclude in summary. If the efforts of community action music programs like Ghetto Classics, Mbale Schools Band, and Emily Sada are justifiable, is an active corridor for musical, educational practice and experience, and innovative thought useful? And would a corridor or corridors between various international support partners with direct action and interest in these initiatives also be useful? Thank you very much. I'm happy to stop there now. I don't know how I'm doing for time.
Levi, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think maybe if we hear from Elizabeth first, and then when we go to a group discussion, maybe there could be some time to share those links and to see some of the video. Really, really interesting discussion. I'd like to ask you about the corridors, but we'll move on to Elizabeth first. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, let's hand over to you.
So thank you very much, Joe. So this afternoon, I'd like to briefly talk about community music initiatives as promoters of desirable global ethics. And Levi has already set the stage for me by introducing Ghetto Classics. So in a way, it's good. There's some of my presentation that has been done for me in that way. And I'm just opening by saying this is the right time to be talking about these things because global interactions are at an all-time high. Probably we would have been physically at St. John's York, which would have been nice, but here we are today. And then community music is an important aspect of music because it provides access, as we've seen from Levi's presentation, for who we would call disenfranchised populaces. But today, as we talk about disenfranchised populaces, I'd like us to ask to consider that it's not only those who are in those circumstances that Levi has alluded to or has talked about, but what about people who are just, they are not poor, but they don't have access to music, to formal music education? I would think that for us who are musicians, we would agree that they are disenfranchised in one way or another. So what about desirable global ethics? Is there any you know, is there this notion of global ethics? Can there be a kind of global ethics? Well, maybe not, but we might say that we would desire to achieve an ethical stance whereby we are continuously working towards attaining harmonious ethical principles, because we are very different as people. And so that is what I wanted to, you know, that's where I would frame my discussion on. And the role of music in this work of coming up with desirable global ethics, I think listening to previous presentations like by Marisa Silverman, we get the idea about ethical action through music, you know, or how we care for participants in the music program, or how music itself provides means of care for people. I'll not do much of the definitions. Most of the definitions do come from Lee Higgins' book, Community Music, and then, of course, you've just met Ghetto Classics. But my big question today is, how can community music initiatives promote desirable global ethics? Seeing that in formal education, as music educators, we are conscious of the fact that we teach people from different cultures, and we are trying to find ways of teaching them, you know, that speaks to each of them. But how about community music? And so there's this intriguing concept that I came across when I first interacted with community music through Lee's work about hospitality. And as an African, it really spoke to me, because Africa is about community, and community is about care and hospitality. And what was even more intriguing was the root of the word, you know, hosting a stranger, but also being hostile. I mean, hosting strangers, but also being hostile to people who are not, who don't speak to what you do. So there's this tension between love and hostility. And I decided to think about that and how it does apply to community music. So another intriguing term that I put together with hospitality is Afropolitan ethics. And because I want to make sure that I keep within my time so that we have time for discussion, I'll pick on the middle point there, that we have national, local, translocal, and global cultures are interlocked, like in Nairobi, where you saw Ghetto Classics. Those are not people in the village. They're in the city, but they're in a certain world that has such a, you know, characteristics of both, all of these things. And so with me, just consider this definition of Afropolitanism. I will read through it as fast as I can, but this is the awareness of this imbrication of here and elsewhere, the presence of the elsewhere in the here and vice versa. This relativization of roots and primary belonging, and a way of embracing, fully cognizant of origins, the foreign, the strange, and the distant, this capacity to recognize oneself in the face of another, and to value the traces of the distant within the proximate, to domesticate the unfamiliar, to work with all manner of contradictions. It is this cultural sensibility, historical and aesthetic, that suggests the term Afropolitanism. And I thought it does speak to what Ghetto Classics does and what other community groups do as well. So I will not really go into the story of Ghetto Classics because you have seen them, but I saw someone type Korogocho in the chat. So I'd like to say that among the youth, the place, this is the physical location of where Ghetto Classics is, and they refer to it as Coach, you know, as the youth. And this is their profile there, you know. I hope these slides will be available for people to read later. But Ghetto Classics performs Western classical music and African art music. So think with me for a minute, what does that mean, you know? And let's look at the story of Joe, who came to Ghetto Classics at 7, with a background of playing traditional drums from one Kenyan community called Ohangla. Very good improviser, but what did it take for him to begin playing in the percussion section of the Western Orchestra? I think it took some of these things, that he had to learn something different. And because of time, again, I'll just take one. So there's this way that Africans learn, and there's this way that we learn in the West. Maybe they're not discrete, but there's, in one tradition, there's more of something than the other. And so to domesticate the unfamiliar, I picked this from the quote about Afropolitanism, that as an act of hospitality, when teaching or learning music from different parts in community music, I would say that participants have to learn different ways in order to act in new ways. And there are ethical implications in that exercise. And therefore, I ask these questions: that what social, emotional, and cultural attributes should the participants discard to embrace the new ways? Why I talk about social, emotional, and cultural is the background of these ghetto classics. People, they live in the ghetto, actually. And within the ghetto, we know what happens. There's crime, and there are so many other things that are not compatible with ethical musical practices. So what does that take, to discard those and embrace new ways? But then there's also the music making. We don't discard what they have, part of it from what they have from their African heritage, but we can interlock old and new ways of music making. How should the facilitators do that, those who work with them? And then how should they communicate with the participants in these things? And I just thought one way would be to acknowledge the connection between music and other facets of a holistic life. I didn't have an opportunity to tell you the story of one of the facilitators and how she works with the girls. And she acknowledges that it is not just about the music making, but they also have to talk about life issues. Thank you for allowing me those extra minutes, Joe, and I stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Goodness, I feel a little bit like the bad guy on this call, keeping everyone to time, but you've done wonderfully, everyone, and thank you so much for your presentations. I think given the time that we have on the call, we did say that we would go to breakouts, but I wonder if we want to stay together in this main space and we can have some discussions that draw on your presentations. So I can see there were a couple of questions coming in the chat, but I just wondered now, and this might mean, Levi, we get time to watch a bit of your clip too. I wondered if anybody in the space has a question for our presenters.
I did, but I just know somebody else did, but I'll just jump in if that's
Go,
okay.
Diana.
I would love to hear from the panelists. Thank you so much. This is really making me think very deeply about a lot of things. And I'm wondering if amongst the panelists, if you'd be willing to talk a little bit around the relationships between the different kinds of musics that you've shared. So there was, we talked about pre-colonial or African traditional kinds of musics, and then like the band orchestra. I presume that would be kind of colonial or maybe post-colonial, maybe its own practice now. I don't know, but I would love to hear you sort of talk about the possibilities and the tensions around these different kinds of music practices that you've talked about together. So I hope that's enough to go on, but I'm thinking around the colonization and how that affects what kind of music is valued and how it's shared and how things get transformed when they're in different places. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Diana. I can see, Levi, you've got your hand up, so go for it, unmute.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Diane. And I don't speak because I have an answer. I do not know the answer to this question, but I think this is the fun bit about creating music in Africa today, is you are inventing as you go. I would like to just point out that making music, the vessel in which you can make music, has got to be secure. So in any society, the people must have a vessel in which they exist, socio-economically. And for example, when you talk about Western art music, it means there's access to instruments in there, and there's access to lessons and access to accessories, and then access to the kind of thinking. And all those are being innovated all the time. But then there isn't necessarily direct access to traditional African instruments, because those are also borderline, what's the word? I want to say obsolete, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Extinct is the word I'm looking for. They're almost extinct. So you don't have access to traditional African music instruments as you would before, but access to the instruments that are instruments of the time is very difficult. And so what you do is you innovate, and both the output of the music as well as the intended practice ends up being a very interesting mix of both worlds all the time. And it's a sort of big ongoing innovation. And I think that's probably one of the things that makes it very special.
Thank you, Levi. Jannalise, I can see you've got your hand up, but before we go to your question, was there anybody else from the panel that wanted to respond to Deanna's comment question? Oh,
Sorry. Yes and no. I had a question or a comment to Levi, but also with Deanne's question about the role that coloniality plays. I think one of the traps that we fall into in Africa when we're talking about community music is almost creating an idealized tradition or creating an idealization of what pre-colonial musicking was. And so I think for me in the work that I do and for my students, it's very important to move away from that idealization and to, as Levi said, to work in the here and now and to invent in what we're doing now. But I also had a question for Levi concerning the corridors. And so I work in a higher education space, so it's very difficult for me to imagine a space outside of that. But community music sits very uncomfortably in higher education. But how does he envision different higher education institutions working together? Because I know for our institution, it's a strategic imperative to build connections to other African institutions, and I'm guessing it's the same across Africa, but somehow we struggle to build these corridors across Africa.
Can we take a few more questions and then come back with answers so we get more people a chance?
Yeah, Levi, that's a lovely idea. I could see Rory has his hand up, and I could also see that Joy had a question earlier in the chat that was asking to talk about, if I can find it again, what do you consider micro-ethical values? And I think that might have been in response to your presentation as well, Levi. So Rory, shall I pass over to you?
Yeah, sure. It's a question that's based on what you're saying, Elizabeth, but it's not necessarily just directed to you. I'd love to hear anyone's perspectives on this. But you talk about the question of what should they discard from the social, emotional, and cultural sort of baggage that you have. So, as someone that works as a white English person in another ghettoized community in the UK, where a lot of people have come from various parts of Africa, what should I discard from my social, emotional, and cultural baggage?
Okay, so what we should discard, as I'm sorry, I was in a hurry to finish, so but I just meant that there are things that are not related to music. You know, for example, in Korogocho, I went there to collect data for a paper I was writing, and I couldn't get a taxi driver to drop me in there. They had to drop me, you know, outside, and then I had to walk in because of the crime. I mean, it is crime prone, yeah. And a lot of the children, or rather those who are performing in those spaces, they come in with that kind of mentality. Actually, Levi will tell you that they have to do so many things, like they have to entice them, you know, that if you don't pick a fight this week, you know, we are going to get, you know, say t-shirts have been donated to the group, yeah, you're going to get a t-shirt, you know, so it gets that basic. So this is what the idea was, that you know, how does the facilitator get rid of that? Because they'll kill each other, you know. You know, you'll not have people, you know, to teach music, I mean to facilitate because of those actions. So how do they help them? And I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but I'd like to just give an illustration. Some of the facilitators of ghetto classes are actually former, or rather they are children, they are within, they've grown up within that area. And what I found in the research is that they are the best placed to, they really know how to, you know, how to get to their people, you know. They know the language to speak with them, the way they teach them. They actually code switch, you know, when they're teaching them something, rhythm, you know, so you hear some slang in here. And in the process, they'll also bring in a wise word, it's not good to fight, it's not going to help you. So I was just thinking about that. And maybe if I extended the discussion, I would have said, I wonder what Levi does, because Levi is also a facilitator there, but he doesn't come from that culture. So what does it take for an outsider, going to work with them, how do they help that? I don't know. Did I say anything that makes
You
sense?
definitely
there?
did. Loads of that was really useful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So we've got some time for some more questions, unless, Levi, you wanted to return to the one that was just asked before. I have a question actually for Mukasa. Mukasa, you framed, you said, what does the community offer the musician, which I thought was very succinctly put, and I was wondering what you might hope or what you might suggest for the community offering the musician, or if you've identified a gap there, what you're thinking might be needed or might be helpful going forward. Oh, and we've got a question to you, Mukasa, from Ruth in the chat, which you can see there if you want to respond to that one.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Concerning your question about, what can the community do for the musician? It is a really difficult question that I may not have an answer to, because, it takes very many people to come up with a consensus on what exactly should be done to the musician. But in our group, we discussed something, and I was looking at it from the perspective of researchers. We are in the research industry. What can we do so that the musician has got at least something that is coming from whoever they are serving? And my response to colleagues that we discussed with in that group, I was looking at the opportunity of doing a more collaborative research, as opposed to a research that is just in one particular direction, where we gather information from these people here and they have got nothing to benefit from the same. And I indicated to them that it will be very interesting that in such a research, we make also the recordings of the music that are presented to us and some of the issues that are raised to them, so that these are not just put on the shelves for the researchers and academicians to read, but also for people to listen to the music that is raw, recorded from the field, as opposed to whatever is refined in the studios. Two, I also indicated to them that it'll be interesting as researchers, not just to be acknowledging that, look, I interviewed Levi on this day in Nairobi, but putting at least a face to who is Levi in our work, so that I have to acknowledge this is a musician trained in a specific way, this is what he practices, this is what he does, and so on. So when we put a face to that, anybody reading this particular work will have an opportunity to relate with this person. And in the event that they need somebody of that caliber, then it is easy for us to reach that particular musician so that they can do what they can get the services that they would like. I also talked about our presentations after research to be mainly academic oriented, where you are describing whatever has happened in the field and what you have analyzed from. But what about having the musicians also to be part of the presentations? By them being part of the presentations, it is a higher level of appreciating whatever they do. And within now the academic circle, there will be actually a umbilical cord between the academicians and the practicing musicians. Otherwise, the way it stands right now, there is actually a huge gap between the two parties, yet they are addressing the same musics. Then on the question from Ruth, she's asking, what do you think are the priorities of the researcher in the community regarding perceptions of the musician's role? I would actually say that basically what the researchers have done is exposing what the community thinks about the musicians, but they have done very little in regard to, bringing these musicians to also have a sense of appreciation. So maybe whatever I have just covered in the previous question, I think basically addresses what Ruth was asking in that particular question. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Mukasa. I can't see any hands up at the moment. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question in the main room? If not, I'd like to go to a comment that was about your presentation, Elizabeth, on the interplay between community music and decolonialism. And I think this is offered from Joy Mayer, and it touches upon Deanna's wider question and comments for everybody in the panel. And Elizabeth, I just wondered if you would talk a little bit more about Joe's story and the implications of Joe's story. So you were mentioning having to learn a different way, not just, you know, having to learn a different form of music, Western art music, different instruments, being in that percussion section, but also the cultural differences. I'd like to hear more about that from you if you want, and also if you can make any connections to kind of higher education music practices. I'll just offer that out.
Yeah, so about the boy, so he was a very good improviser. You know, he would come up with, create rhythms. You know what we do with African music, you know, you have this short maybe motif and you extemporize on it, you extend it. And so he was very good at that. And he would play in our national, we have a national music festival for schools and colleges. So he would be invited and he would play, and he would actually get prizes for that. But when he came into ghetto classics, it was difficult for him because, you know, now this was a literacy. He had to, you know, he would have to read rhythm, you know, and then play it. So the facilitator, who happened also to be a former, you know, as I said, grew up in ghetto classics, began to understand it. And so he came up with different ways of helping the young boy to read rhythm. For example, he would use mnemonics, you know, pa 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 ta 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 ki ki ki, and so on, you know, so that he was internalizing it more through the ear than initially through the eyes. Because what they do at Ghetto Classics, and Levi can also weigh in on this because he is a facilitator there. So they invite them in, and then they come, and because they have to play Western classical music, they have to read music. So they do divide them into groups, and then, you know, they have them graduating from, I think, from C. You see I think you start from C and then you get to A, you know. So they keep, you keep graduating. The more the better you become at playing. So Joe, one of the things that the facilitator did was the use of mnemonics. Now, mnemonics in African music is one of the ways that they learn instruments, because since rhythm is not written down, and since our ear, you know, the African ear is one of the strongest way in which music is made. So when the mnemonics are, you know, when you memorize, like I remember when we were in college, those who took drums as their African instrument, I still remember rhythms like ngakaka chichichi ngakaka, you know, and it's not just about the word, it is also the pitching, because our instruments, our drums are also pitched in a certain way. So the mnemonics are both rhythmic as well as pitch. They speak to both rhythm and pitch. So that is one way, Joe, in which there's a divide between how we do learn music in the African setting and the Western setting. And it's interesting that this facilitator, who is a young boy who has not gone for any methods course, you know, he came up with this way because he could bridge the two, you know, he could form a corridor between the West and the Eastern way of learning. What was the other issue, Joe, that you asked? Sorry, I think I got carried away with the explanation.
No, it's just if you would talk more widely about the implications or what this means in terms of decolonization, as we've had recent discussions in higher education lately, we've talked about previously. So just drawing on that to go to those places.
Yes, thank you. So again, coming to decolonization, recently there was the Research in Music Education Conference, the one that takes place in the UK. And we were doing a presentation, and one of the last presentations was very interesting because Susan Young from the UK was talking about decolonization versus decolonization rather than inclusion. we are very big on inclusion now. We are talking of inclusion. Okay, so include this music, include this music. But then the problem with inclusion is that everybody, we try to bring everybody into the same space, but we forget that where they're coming from, they have their story, you know. For example, Kenya, our music curriculum in Kenya, when I look at the early childhood music curriculum, if I may call it that, it's really more of an activity guide. So they talk about children will sing songs, children will dance, and they'll sing Christmas songs. And then they do forget something about the way we make music in Africa. If they want to introduce the children to African music, there's something called the way the African music making is very holistic. So there's singing, there's dancing, there's drama, all put in together. So if they want the children to grow up understanding the way, you know, like singing games, the way they happen, why costume is important, then they have to think about it holistically. But because of our colonial roots and the fact that we got to study music in school based on the Western tradition, not because of anything bad, but simply this, that formal education was introduced to us from the West. And so, I mean, they could only do what they knew, you know. So singing is separate from dancing, which is, you know, and you don't have to wear a costume to dance, and you don't have to tell a story within the song. These are different things. But then in our own setting, when we are doing our own music, they're actually together. So this is where inclusion does not work. This is where you actually have to think differently. You have to take on a different stance, and you have to understand that that way of making music is just as legitimate as this way. And then another thing is we talk about education in music, education through music, and we think about them very differently, you know. So if I'm talking about education in music, I'm going to focus on the musical aspect, but not the non-musical aspects. But this is really not the way it was done in Africa, because music was a way of learning things. You know, you learned colors through music, you learned to count, you learned behavioral, you know, how to behave through music. And so if you bring it into the school in that way, then it is important to bring it in as a holistic entity. Now, those are very big ideas. And the problem is what we've just talked about, the Afropolitanism. I myself didn't grow up in the fully African tradition. So I have a bit of this and a bit of that. So it is really daunting, you know, this decolonization. I don't know what it means. Maybe Wafula will tell us. Does it mean I have to go back and wear a different, you know, lens and start behaving that way, or is there a way we can carry a bit of both? I don't know. There are no easy answers to that. Thank you, Jo.
No, thank you, Elizabeth. I was going to pose one final question to the group, but Levi, I can see you've got your hand up, so I think we're over to you.
Thank you, Jo. I just wanted to answer the two questions that Joy Maya asking about what referring to as microethics, and that very layman language, microethics in what we look at as the basic aspects of any human being. So we try to internalize microethics as being kind and being patient and being, you know, those characters that help you live with your immediate surroundings on a personal level. And so those are the key lessons of community music programs in the settings that Elizabeth has just described so well. And but we are trying to impact this microethical thought to every individual person, at the same time in the context of the macroethical reality that actually sometimes it makes it difficult to do that. And finally, to Janelise, who asked about corridors at university level. Now, to be honest, I had thought of corridors at our community practitioner level, and just because there's so many things that are directly similar, I have put on the chat a conference that is ongoing at the moment that I'm a part of, and there's a couple of papers being presented there right now that are about collaborative work, collaborative research, looking at cultural differences between different places and putting it together. I think this is just my personal opinion, and as I get more into academia, I might learn better. But at the moment, I feel like academia is directly opposed to the organic way in which progress can be achieved in the kind of work that we have been doing. Because when you present something that is real and organic, then you have to figure out how to lens it and how to separate it into little bits, and how to say, oh, we're not focusing on, we're focusing on summative assessment only, and we're not focusing on lesson delivery. Academia tends to separate these things, and I would defer to somebody who maybe is a little better versed in academia to advise on how those corridors can be built.
Thank you, Levi, and we're almost coming to an end, and I can see there might be some responses for you, but I think maybe if we could go to just one final question, because it is for all of the presenters, and it's being asked by Catherine, so we'll perhaps end on this final question, which is to all of the panel, everybody presenting. As a community musician working in the UK, what can we learn from the values and intentions of music making programs across Africa, especially with regards to the holistic approach that Elizabeth mentioned? So that's Catherine asking from a UK context. What can we learn from the values and intentions of music making programs across Africa?
Okay. I'm going to start, but I'm going to ask Joe kindly. I'll ask Wafula to also really talk about this, because I think he can do it. So I'll just open by saying this, that there's an intriguing notion in African music making about humaning. It's humanistic, it's about the human being. For example, I was reading something and it really didn't make sense. When we think about solo chorus, a lot of times we think of the soloist as to some extent superior to the chorus. Rather, that's the way it does get. But in the African setting, it's the other way around, that the solo draws their importance from the chorus. And that's why call and response music is what it is. So you can imagine somebody calling with no response, No, people have to respond. So there's this, I think one of the important things about the music is that everybody matters in the music making. There's no maestro. Okay, there's somebody who plays a certain role, but they always do it in relation to everybody else. Okay, so I've said I think I'll let the others weigh in on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Wafula, did you want to add?
I mean, she has said it in a very, very wonderful manner. In fact, I wonder why she wanted me to say something about it. But at the end of the day, it is about the music philosophy, that the African music philosophy might be slightly different from other parts of the world. All right. So in understanding that it is a unique philosophy, then even in terms of education, then we have to also approach the education from what? From its own philosophy, as opposed to taking another philosophy and mapping it onto this particular music here. And I like it because Dr. Andang'o has talked about, the way the music is a factor, or rather different persons within an arena of music making are actually factors of the entire music process. But there is not one that is separated from the music. For instance, you'll find even some people who are not singing, who are not clapping, who are not dancing, but they will just do what? Contribute some information. Yes, talk about this. No, that dance is not going. They are still part of what? They're still part of that particular music. So the whole philosophy is doing what? Of bringing everyone together, so that in that corporate interaction, the music is more holistic, and that again, the music is not divided into sections, so that you have a song part only, you have a dance part only, you have a narrative part only. They are all happening either at the same time or interchangeably, so that they form a basic whole. So in terms of education, what has been the biggest challenge? is accepting the truth of how the music is holistic, how the music brings together different players, how the creative process of African music is quite unique in its own way. And this way, getting an education philosophy that can bring out the entire philosophy of the African music. Basically, that is what I would say in the shortest time that we have. But if we had a little more time, this could be a topic that actually we can put on the table and have many more ideas. Yeah.
Well, that's a lovely way to bring us to a close. Thank you so much for your responses there, and thank you for all of your presentations today. Thank you, Phibion and Wafula and Elizabeth and Levi today for those presentations and your discussion. I just think we need to give everybody a big round of applause because it was really, really insightful. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful.